Since the Garden of Eden, mankind has bothered animals for their wool and hair in a never-ending contest for dominance over the elements. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Knitting is very much an Australian pastime, and we stand proud in our part of its history, particularly in the Southern Downs town of Warwick in Queensland, where wool growing played a big part in its prosperity. We're putting the spotlight on the quiet achievers, men who knit, and we investigate the phenomenon behind the knitting revival through their eyes and others who personify the spirit of jumpers and jazz. We approached local men's groups to discover how many male knitters there were among us. Surprisingly, their responses have been defensive, most common response being, "This is a men's group. We don't do that stuff here." I'd be too scared to even ask the question. They'd probably throw rocks at me. And if we did, we wouldn't tell you. Clearly, the collective memory of knitting being a male occupation has been diluted, and the rank downgraded to the drawer marked women's work. We don't think so. Strange as it may seem to some, men historically have been the knitters. Knitting was once thought of as an exclusive gentleman's occupation, involving rigorous testing and scrutinisation, with cutthroat competition and cold business running through its core. Teenage boys who wanted to become knitters would become apprentices and leave their families to live with master knitters for 6 years, who'd provide food and board while they produced detailed and extraordinary work. We interviewed some local men and women who knit, crochet, quilt, spin, weave and craft. And these are their stories.
Well, I went to a quilt show one year, and it was in a church, and I was sort of looking at all the blankets that were hanging up on the wall and that, and I seen one there with the 4 seasons. And when I seen that, that's sort of what got me into sort of having a go at the patchwork. Then I ended up doing a sewing class and that, learned how to use sewing machines. Because I'm into the art side and I like landscapes, that's sort of what got me started on it. Yeah. Thought I'll have a go at it, try it, and since I started I've been enjoying it ever since. I think it's a craft I'll never give up. I don't use patterns or anything when I do this. I think it up as I go along and just add to it. Start from the top and work my way to the bottom. Takes about 2 years to sort of do the big ones, and I've done 2 of them. Well, that's 4 years that I've done those 2 in. So, and I've got the one on the left to still finish. The table runner, I decided to come up with an idea, put a light under a glass coffee table, and I'd done the drawing on a bit of paper on some sandwich wrap paper, done it on there, sat it under the material, turned the light on, and it's like a light box, and then I just transferred it onto the material, and then I just went along and embroidered it, and that took probably about 8 months to do. But it's just the colour in it that sort of I like, and the finished picture. I've been drawing ever since I was young, probably about 5 years old, and then started doing the landscapes, sitting and sketching them, and then got into the patchwork. Been doing the patchwork for a fair while, but I do still do a little sketching here and there. Yeah, no, it's good when it's finished and that, because you've got through all the heavy stuff in it, like all the stitching all finished. It's sort of good to feel a bit more relaxed and that, and look back at what they've done. I go to a craft group, the CWA here in Warwick, and I go to another craft group on Friday. I don't mind sort of being the only male in amongst the ladies. I reckon it's a lot of fun. It's a good way to meet a lot of friends. And I probably know so many people around town now because of the crafts and that. It's good. Always got someone to talk to. I'm very proud of what I do, and like so the experience I've had with the ladies being the only male, well, that makes it even more interesting because I'm sort of facing something I've never faced when I was younger. Overcome the fear, all that sort of thing. You just feel like a part of the group in the end.
So why don't more men knit? Is there perhaps a nagging recollection deep down in their minds of mum's knitting creations during the 70s? Unexpectedly, this close-knit group of male artisans are not as rare as you may think. During the Renaissance, only men were allowed to join knitting guilds. Later, Scottish sailors and sheep herders used downtime to knit sweaters. And even after women took over the craft during the World Wars, injured soldiers were encouraged to knit as therapy. American and Australian schoolboys and girls were taught to knit squares to be sewn into blankets for the troops. In Victoria, where demand for needles exceeded supply, bicycle spokes were turned into knitting needles and sold to other states, so the production continued for the troops. Did you know that humble knitters were used in espionage during the two world wars? Those who study encryption know that for centuries, wartime knitting developed devious powers in secret knitted codes, crafted directly into the stitches of garments that were passed along to allies who decrypted the strands and then planned their retaliation. With enough expertise and calm nerves, a clever person could pass detailed messages right under the noses of even the most intelligent adversary. Eventually, the high amount of distrust meant that printed knitting patterns were banned from being mailed in Britain during World War II, just in case they contained secret codes.
Well, I was about 9 when I started, and I think I pestered my mother to blazes like I wanted to learn to knit, because we at the school, when we were at school, we started knitting squares for the war, and I always liked that. I looked at it as a hobby and it's artistic. Well, I wasn't sexist or anything. It wasn't the ladies and it wasn't the men. The sailors, they used to knit their own jumpers for when they sailed on the sea. It was just something to pass the time away. When you're on a farm, you didn't have all your mod cons and all press buttons and things like you have today. I used to ask permission in front of my father-in-law could I knit.
Huh? Really?
Well, that was when when you're growing up and your mother and those were in the guild, an assignment by the guilds they used to send parcels to Korea, and they you just made up everything from jumpers to whatever. Yeah, well, she knitted about 100 socks for the war. But we had to sit there like this while she unravelled the skeins. You didn't get them in balls in those days, and they'd be knotty, and you'd be losing patience. Well, I knitted my children's jumpers as a pastime. The wife knitted one, but we used to have a race, but she had too much other things on her hands. But it was something that kept me occupied because, well, we didn't have TV in those days, and found out something to occupy your minds. Well, it's patience. It gives you patience. I might have my supper and then I'll do a couple of rows knitting, and that sort of relaxes you. I have got a blue jumper I knitted when I was about, half this size, but I couldn't find it to bring it. They're not. You take that one on top there. It's not designed, but it's got a lot of little things in you. Just put in just to do, make it interesting to yourself. My wife was, well, oriented towards making children's clothes. And of course, when your children grown up and they had a bit of colic and they had a bit of asthma and things like that, and you mightn't get to bed till 12 o'clock, so you had to find something to do. Praise the Lord that He gave me, as I put in my word for next week. We've all been given talents to use. We're not to worry about I'm not to be jealous of what he does. I'm not to be jealous of what you do. He's given me a talent and I'm to use that to my fullest extent, you know. Well, that's how I look at it anyhow. You like doing it and it passes the time away. Yeah. That's my hobby.
Before woven cloth, there was spun thread, making spinning almost as old as civilization itself. For thousands of years, fibre was spun by hand using simple tools from stones to sticks. Until the invention of the spinning wheel, the drop spindle was the main spinning tool used to make all the threads for clothing and fabrics. This small device was used to spin fibre through the ages, from Egyptian money wrappings to tapestries, and even the ropes and sails for ships for almost 9,000 years. In later times, single ladies who spun this way garnered the name spinsters. Weaving is also one of the oldest surviving practices in the world, and the making of woven fabrics increased with every household producing cloth for personal use. Weaving became an indispensable skill and was closely connected to the family unit, a tradition that would endure endlessly.
I grew up with it, I suppose, because my mother was always knitting or crocheting or sewing or doing something like that. Because she was so good at all of those things, I wanted something that she wasn't good at or didn't know about. And I came across, when I was at work, a woman who was spinning. She used to bring in her yarn and show us what she'd spun over the weekend, and I thought that seems pretty cool. And so I asked her how, and she said, come round and I'll show you. And I sort of got hooked on spinning wheels and spinning and all that sort of thing then. I could spin a fleece a week one time, but I can't do it now. How do you start learning to spin? Well, first of all, you've got to have some sort of an interest. You have to see somebody who does it so you know that it's possible. And you have to have a fleece and a spinning wheel. And my first fleece came from Longreach, and they told me it was a good fleece. They didn't tell me it was full of burrs and prickles and grass seeds and rubbish. And I persevered and I spun this stuff. Somebody who was a spinner happened to see what I'd done, and she said, if that doesn't put you off spinning forever, nothing will. So I got myself a decent fleece, which is an entirely different kettle of fish. That's how it ballooned. I started weaving very simply, and I still weave simply, because I think fleece that's grown for spinners in all its colours, from natural coloured sheep, has enough variation in itself without putting complicated patterns and things like that in it. But to each his own. Those who do it, I take my hat off to them. As I say, I do very simple weaving, but I do things called ruanas, which are based on South American ponchos, capes, open up the front, folded back, scarves by the million, and mostly straight weaving like that. Blankets, I've done blankets of all sizes. I've got one on my bed at home. It's queen size. I've had it for 40 years, so one of the first things I did. So durability is great. I made a jacket for my daughter-in-law, and she wore it for 20 years. She's not a natural fibre person, she's an acrylic person, but she looked after this garment for 30 years or so. And then her daughter-in-law put it in the washing machine and then the dryer, and it kind of turned into a bed jacket. So some things you cannot do with wool. You've got to treat it respectfully. As I say, in my heyday, I'd be up at it at 6 o'clock before I got the kids off to school and before I went to work, and when I got home from work, I'd spin till all hours of the night. With Warwick Group, because I joined Warwick Group back in '81, we've had lots of dues, and we had a very big part of Woolaway, which was to be a biennial event. Unfortunately, only lasted 2 years. But that event, we had a fleece to fabric competition from teams, and we had, I think, about 4 or 5 teams from all over Queensland came. You had a preparer, a spinner, and a plier, and then you knit it, and everybody had to produce a square of a certain size, and that was the competition. So fleece to fabric, and then we joined all those squares together. We made another blanket which we raffled. Yes, when I first joined the group in Warwick, there was John Nation, who was the sheep and wool advisor at the time, taught a lot of the early members to spin because he was interested in spinning and weaving. And in the 60s there was a downturn in the sheep and wool industry, which he was concerned about, and he started teaching growers' wives mainly to spin and how to use their yarn to sell to the public so that they could augment their income a little bit. So when I joined, there was a fellow called John Wayne with a W-A-I-N, not Y-N-E, and he was an excellent spinner, and he had made his own spinning wheel, very basic, very rudimentary, but he used to spin wool for socks for soldiers during the war. And his wife was a good spinner. She was a good everything, good craftswoman of everything. But he was good with his woodwork and with his spinning. So, and he taught a lot of people too. And we've had male members over the years. I mean, Bruce McGuigan, who used to be on TV here and around the district, he and his wife both spun. I mean, she was a friend of mine and started spinning first, and then he got the bug and he'd spin, and yeah, there were others. Quite a few others actually, men during the time. It's not solely a woman's occupation at all.
Fads and fashions with wool have changed with time. Nowadays, new age designers create patterns which work up quickly on large needles, a phenomenon known as instant gratification knitting. What do you give a man who has everything nowadays? A knitted beard, maybe? How about a knitting tattoo, or simply his first set of knitting needles and a ball of wool? YouTube can even get you started on the road to knitting.
Every time we had like a new baby in the family, she would knit a layette set. And I got all the leftover wool. So I would just play with it and stuff. And eventually she gave me some knitting needles and said, well, if you're going to play with it, do something with it. She half taught me and I sort of just picked up from her. She didn't formally teach me. She just would go, no, that's got a hole in it, pull it out, start again. So it was mum really. But it was something that just went right through everything. Like even today, if there's a new baby coming, out comes the knitting needles, mum gets hers out, I get mine out, and off we go, knitting a little layette set or something like that. So that was the start of it. It was probably about when I was 9 years old or something, 10 years old or something. That tended to be very plain knitting when I was little. Then I explored lots of different other crafts, and when I got married, for some reason I started back into knitting again, and that sort of went into things like this, where still plain knitting, but added in the colours and textures and stuff like that. You have to be able to count your rows or keep track of them in some way. There's lots of little things you can buy and put it on the end, but I actually rewrite the whole pattern and cross off every row as I do it. That's the way I find is the most accurate way. So if I'm knitting, that's very meditative to me. And I always will pick so I wouldn't knit something like this, I would knit straight, one colour, and I can still mull over what I'm stressed over, but I'm creating at the same time, and it just calms me down. And very often, once you're calm, you actually can look at that problem in a different way. But I come back to the core things that I've learnt, and knitting's one of those, is crocheting. I come back to those core things because they're the things that are entrenched in me from childhood, and I think they're the things that keep me calmest. People have realised they need to slow down, and one of the things to slow down with is going back to our traditional handcrafts. Whether it's crocheting or whether it's knitting or whether it's making cards, it doesn't really matter what it is, but it's just doing something that is something that you can say when you're finished, I created that. And a lot of people have missed that. Generations are missing that. So by going back to their original craft, maybe that their mothers or their grandmothers have done, just makes such a difference. And they're realising, hey, I can actually do this. And I think that's one positive thing, that people realise we can do this.
The knitting revival today, what's behind it? Knitting has come back as more of a recreational hobby than a necessity. Men of all ages and walks of life are picking up the needles for the same reasons as women do. They They like it, and it's great therapy. They simply got sidetracked over the years and now are finding their way back to the knitting needles. Knitting has even been introduced into male prisons as a way to help rehabilitate prisoners. With knitting comes a wonderful community of fellow crafters and a fantastic outlet for creativity. It's tradition and innovation intertwining to herald the past and embrace the future. Knitting's as Australian as scones with Rosella jam and mint sauce and gravy on Mum's roast lamb. It's like billy tea and damper and spuds cooked in a fire and making do with what you've got, our history to inspire. When I'm at my knitting, I have no need to think. My fingers shift to auto and I de-stress in a blink. It's a bit of engineering mixed up with creative design with truckloads of perseverance and designated time. The blokes think it's textile fusion, generating merchandise. The girls of family comfort, bodies warm under grey skies. And in between the stitches there's an everlasting hug. That's a real meaning of something made with love. Knitting in Australia in the burning heat in preparation for winter to warm our freezing feet. Because when it gets below 20, we think our throat's been cut. Focus on the importance of being able to rug up. Up north it gets cold, you have to put on a long sleeve shirt, but in Warwick in the winter, we dress our trees with our handiwork. Don't assume it's all about booties and 1,000 woolen scarves. You'll find knitted kitchens and caravans, even the occasional car. These artisans are zealous, devoted to their woolly craft, and the footpaths to the rooftops are a festival of their art. Some people say it's peculiar, others call it insane to decorate the vegetation in the sleet and icy rain. But you've got to admit it's original and definitely outside the norm. And if you drop by around July, the welcome will definitely be warm.